Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Extension Development Studies, SOEDS, Master of Arts Urban Studies, MAUS, Second Year, MEDS 047 Ecology, Environment and Urban Development, Block-1 Key Environmental Issues, Unit-4 Natural Resource Management, 4.1 Introduction. One of the most critical issues on the national and global agenda is the need to preserve natural resources for future generations while trying to meet the present-day demand. Today, the entire world has awakened to the need for sustainable development by maintaining judicious use of the natural resources and adopting developmental models and policies which assure proper environmental protection. It is well known that the humans all across the globe are not only polluting nature but also destroying it through an aggressive expansion of urbanization vis-a-vis consumerism. Some 11,000 years back, agriculture started in the lap of nature, and at its beginning, it was a beautiful synergy between human technique and rhythmic nature. This went on with smiling, dancing and rippling notes of traditional wisdom and bounties of nature. As an aftermath of Second World War and, till then, unabated mechanization as well as increasing use of chemicals have been transforming our agriculture into a huge source of pollution of the environment and nature on the one hand, and beginning of industrial and commercial harvesting of natural resources have resulted in beginning of unsustainable natural resources management practices mostly in the developing and underdeveloped world. After studying this unit, you should be able to understand 1. The role of natural resource in the life human being, 2. Impact of development activities on the natural resource base, 3. Impact of development on the natural resource management strategies, 4. Role of various government bodies in the management of natural resources, 5. Factors responsible for the depletion and over-exploitation of natural resources, 6. Various threats in the management of natural resources. 4.2 Meaning and types of natural resources. Natural resources has been defined as the sum total of all physical, chemical, biological and social factors which construct the surroundings of man is referred to as environment, and each element of these surroundings constitutes a resource on which man thrives in order to develop a better life. Any part of our natural environment, such as land, water, air, minerals, forest, rangeland, wildlife, domesticated animals, fish, microorganisms and even the human population which man can utilize for his survival and his welfare is regarded as a natural resource. There are two types of natural resources, viz. Exhaustible and inexhaustible natural resources. Exhaustible resources are limited in nature and liable to be degraded in quantity and quality by the human activities such as forests, soil, water and fossil fuels, etc. Inexhaustible natural resources are unlimited in nature and they are not likely to be exhausted by human activities like solar radiation, air and precipitation, etc. The detailed understanding of various linkages that exist in nature can be put under one broad term: environment, which surrounds an organism and influences its life in many ways. It includes physical and biological components. The physical components of the environment are soil, water, air, light and temperature. These are termed as abiotic components. The plants and animals are collectively referred to as biotic components. All these components of the environment work together, interact and modify the effect of one another. Water, about 70 to 73% of Earth is covered by water. Water is available in the form of oceans, seas, rivers, lakes, ponds, pools, polar ice caps and water vapor, and this forms the hydrosphere. The main component of hydrosphere is water. Water exists in all the three forms, i.e., solid, snow, liquid, water, and gas, water vapor. Air, it is an inexhaustible natural resource and very essential for the survival of all the living organisms on Earth. In atmosphere, about 95% of the total air is present up to a height of 20 kilometers above the Earth's surface. The remaining 5% of air is present up to a height of about 280 kilometers. Air is a mixture of different gases. Nitrogen and oxygen are the major components. Thus, total volume of air present in atmosphere consists of 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and remaining 1% is made up of other gases such as argon, neon, helium, krypton, xenon and radon. Soil. The word soil is derived from a Latin word solum meaning ground. It is a stratified mixture of inorganic and organic materials, both of which are products of decomposition. Minerals. Earth's crust is rich in inorganic materials which include ores that are used on a large scale to yield metals such as iron, aluminum, copper, tin, nickel, silver, gold, platinum, etc. These minerals are very useful in industrial and technological growth. Some of the metals are used as catalysts, for example, vanadium, tungsten and molybdenum. Some of the non-metallic materials, minerals, are vital to industrial growth such as sand, fluxes, clay, salt, sulfur, phosphorus, diamonds, gems, coal and byproducts of petroleum, petrol, kerosene, lubricants. Flora and fauna. Flora refers to plant species and fauna refers to animal species. The term biota includes both plant as well as the domesticated and wild species of animals. Our country has a rich diversity of flora and fauna. There are over 45,000 plant species and 81,251 animal species. It represents about 7% of world's flora and 6.5% of world's fauna. Biodiversity. Biodiversity is the variation of life forms within a given ecosystem, biome, or for the entire Earth. Biodiversity is often used as a measure of the health of biological systems. The biodiversity found on Earth today consists of many millions of distinct biological species, which is the product of nearly 3.5 billion years of evolution. Biological diversity or biodiversity can have many interpretations and it is most commonly used to replace the more clearly defined and long-established terms species diversity and species richness. Biologists most often define biodiversity as the totality of genes, species, and ecosystems of a region. An advantage of this definition is that it seems to describe most circumstances and present a unified view of the traditional three levels at which biological variety has been identified: genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. 4.3 Institutions in Natural Resource Management. Natural Resource Management, NRM, refers to the sustainable utilization of major natural resources such as land, water, air, minerals, forests, fisheries, and wild flora and fauna. Natural resource management is the management of all activities that use, develop or conserve our air, water, land, plants, animals and microorganisms, and the systems they form. Natural resources are shared by all users. It is non-exclusive, finite, and if one person is misused, then it will affect all the resource users. That is why understanding the characteristics of natural resources are important to understand the role of institution in natural resource management. These resources together provide the source of sustenance to all living beings along with the ecosystem services for better quality to human life. It also provides fundamental life support in the form of both consumptive and public good services. Ecological processes maintain soil productivity, nutrient recycling, the cleansing of air and water, and climatic cycles. NRM can then be further defined as a management of interactions between people and natural landscapes for a number of economic activities such as together land use planning, water management, biodiversity conservation, agriculture, mining, tourism, fisheries and forestry. The local population has a bigger interest than the state in ensuring that resources remain available for long-term utilization upon which their survival depends. The role of local, community and different institutions in the management of natural resources at local level is as complex as the complexities of the ecosystems. There is a huge misunderstanding between researchers from natural and social sciences who have attempted to understand the natural resource management separately from their own discipline perspectives, leading to over-simplification of the issues of continued degradation of biodiversity and ecosystem services. The diversified interest groups in our society have their own interests in the natural resources of their region. As such, any given decision is neither purely wrong nor purely right from a management perspective. All these different stakeholders have different levels of uncertainties about the availability and management of the resource base, but the impacts of some decisions are mostly borne by the natural resource, some by the resource exploiters, and some by competing stakeholders. 4.3.1 Types of institutions in natural resource management. There are various types of institutions that are engaged in the management of natural resources, and they range from formal to informal, religious and customary to cultural and social. All these institutions have formal and informal interactions between individuals and various types of groups in the society. Few organizations such as water user associations, village forestry committees, common grazing follows few code of conduct decided by the end users of the resources. All these institutions have either formal or informal rules about making decisions that are permitted and are assigned to an individual or a group of individuals. The primary emphasis of natural resource management is based on interactions with formal institutions and society to regulate the users and management strategy in such a way that resources are utilized in a sustainable manner. Besides, there are also views which lay more emphasis on informal institution and community-based management of natural resources, which has also been recognized as informal institution. One of the most pressing issues on the national and global agenda is the need to conserve the natural resources for future generations while trying to understand and document the indigenous knowledge of resource management practices. So far, this challenge has been partially addressed by the local, national and global agencies who have restricted themselves to conservation of natural resources as outlined by the World Commission on Environment and Development, which led to calls for sustainable development. As a result, the model of development, which was foisted upon the indigenous and tribal groups in far-flung remote areas of developing not fully concerned with the local needs. This kind of top-down approach does not understand the concept of informal institutions and the local arrangements that exist in the management of natural resources. Now, it has been realized by the scholars and researchers that indigenous knowledge systems should constitute the core of development models in the developing world. Because indigenous knowledge has permitted its holders to exist in harmony with nature, allowing them to use it sustainable, it is seen as especially pivotal in discussions of sustainable resource use. 4.3.2 Role of formal institution in natural resource management. The role of formal institution in natural resource management varies according to the approach and purpose of the institution and persons heading the institution. Some of the aspects such as equity, inclusiveness, public participation and good governance play a very important role in the management of natural resources. There are many types of formal institutions, like the government institutions, private institutions, NGOs, etc., and all these institutions are governed by the purpose and objectives of the parent institution. The government institutions are considered as a real representative of formal institution, since government institutions are entrusted with making and enforcing the rules of a society as well as with regulating relations with other societies. A person or group that considers itself the leading body of a society has no power if the members of the society do not recognize the person or group as such. In the same way, a formal or government institution plays a dynamic role in natural resource management, such as government institutions try to manage the natural resources through imposing rules and regulations, privatization, public tenure, leasing and community-based management though their initiative to manage natural resource. These rules and regulations become ineffective when there are violation of rules by the government body itself and most of the time because of corruption within the system. 4.3.3 Role of informal institution in natural resource management. The concept of informal institutions is as vague as the existence of institution itself. In more often than not, it connotes a different meaning to different individuals at different period of time. This suggests that informal institutions may elicit more than one meaning depending on the context. However, broadly it can be understood as the socially shared rules, usually unwritten, that are created, communicated, and enforced outside of officially sanctioned government channels. Informal institutions are mostly based on cultural beliefs and practices. They may be considered as unwritten form of doing thing that is guided by social norms, values, tradition, taboos and sanctions. From the above definition and its context, the conceptualization of informal institutions has some indicators for natural resource management, times social and cultural beliefs and norms, times mostly not codified, times non-state sanctioned regulations, times systems enforced by actors, local people, themselves, and times rarely could mean clandestine activities such as bribery and corruption. Informal institutions are also considered as traditional cultural systems. They are considered to involve the traditional governance arrangements including chieftaincy and traditional priesthood systems and cultural belief systems. They are mostly seen in the developing world where traditional systems and practices still continue to wield influence. Informal institution exists in every community and where the social norms, values and traditions guide the management of the natural resources. Informal institutions originated from local culture and have strong roots in the past. In NRM, traditional cultural systems and norms play very important role in the management and utilization of resources by the community. It is interesting to note that the traditional institutions created by the local people without any external interference have set an example of community management and sharing of resources by the community itself. Few case studies from the Himalaya clearly demonstrate the indigenous effort and initiatives taken by the community collectively and the acceptance of their decision by the entire villages of the region and Gram Panchayat. The case study is about successful management and sharing of grass economy by the Dhundar Valley people of Uttarakhand, where collective decision by the village community under the concept of social equity functions well in sharing the harvested grass for livestock by 3 villages in Bhundar Valley of the region in Nanda Devi Biosphere Reserve area of Chamoli district, Kala and Faruqi, 2003. 4.3.4 Characteristics of renewable natural resources times these resources are capable of regeneration. Times these are renewed along with exploitation and hence always available for use times the regeneration of these sources involves some ecological processes on a time scale times the renewable sources become non-renewable if used at a greater rate than the environment's capacity to replenish them. Times these resources comprise materials like food, timber, raw materials for clothing, leather, etc. These also include oxygen, fresh water, solar energy and biomass. 4.4 Governance in natural resource management. The governance of renewable natural resources is particularly complex and challenging due to multiple levels of stakeholders ranging from direct and indirect users to institutions involved in the management and accounting of the resource base. There are many groups of people directly dependent on the resources for their subsistence. Another group tries to maximize the prospects of livelihood benefits. One group of stakeholders tries raising revenue for government and ensuring sustainable management so that the resources are replenished and available for future generations. These stakeholder groups are likely to have different interests, objectives and degrees of power that, in turn, influence their potential for participating in and benefiting from natural resource governance. Men and women are likely to have different degrees of participation in and power over governance systems, especially at the local level. Many formal and informal institutions affect the nature and performance of natural resource governance, from formal policies and structures to kinship, gender norms and power relations. The institutional picture may therefore be complex, with people navigating or drawing on multiple institutions forming arrangements to claim benefits from natural resources and to make and implement management decisions. Many natural resources span administrative boundaries, requiring cooperation and coordination within and between multiple levels of government administration, sometimes even between countries. The issue of scale and associated multilevel governance is critical. Many natural resources, including in developing countries, are common pool resources jointly managed and used by the community. This category of resource base is characterized by high costs of exclusion, which means that it is difficult to exclude people from using the resources. 4.4.1 Stakeholders, mechanisms and rights in natural resource governance. Governance comprises of institutions, powers, and knowledge through which human and social decisions and actions are made. All governance issues are political in nature due to the dominance of interest groups, and effective governance by the decision makers affects the end users' actions and outcomes. It also influences their knowledge, actions and benefits which one derives from a resource base. Governance is the decision, management and implementation which include the actions of the state as well as those of actors such as communities, businesses, development actors and NGOs. The success of different forms and types of natural resource governance is the combination of socio-cultural, political, economic and interests of the dominance groups that institutions embody the relationships which shape the actions and outcomes. The other non-empirical and externalities like the customary laws and practices, non-organizational institutional mechanisms and aspects of decision-making also play a vital role. The governance of natural resources. 4.4.2 Natural resource governance. Natural resource governance is a series of actions and interventions that change the traditional practices, beliefs, incentives, information, and institutions related to natural resource use and management. It further influences the thinking, attitude, and behavior of all stakeholders, beneficiaries, and officials related with the resource base. It also refers to the processes, mechanisms, and organizations through which the decision makers exercise their powers. It is difficult to analyze and discuss natural resource governance without discussing the issues of interests, knowledge, power, and the size of resource base. The role of institutions, information, and incentives that influence natural resource outcome is very vital in understanding the governance issues relating to the natural resource management. Governance by its very nature is political because it involves political actors such as governments, customary institutions, community, business, and profit motives. Hence, the issues of power, knowledge, and resources are central to its understanding and analysis. Natural resource governance also includes the issues that extend beyond politics, since its focus is on natural and environmental resources and the various mechanisms, processes, and organizations that shape it. Therefore, natural resource governance brings biophysical and socio-political issues together in a much more interesting and important ways. It is useful here to analyze the existing differences in power between different groups and interests like the local body and the government body and their implications for the principles of good governance. Not to forget the existing differences at different scales and levels like the difference between women and men, the economically poor and rich, the urban and rural, and the agricultural and pastoralist, the extent to which interventions related to natural resource governance in mountains differentially benefit women and men depends on their meaningful and effective engagement in institutions of decision-making as well as governance institutions, incentives, and development processes, which are in turn influenced by relations of power. Governance does not always act down on citizens and actors, but is actively interpreted, negotiated, and resisted. Hence, it is important to address and ensure the principles of good governance. Similarly, incentives and resources do not exist in political and social vacuums but are actively negotiated and contested. 4.5 Issues in utilization of natural resources. A number of activities relating to development including construction, activities of all kinds, forest-based industries, hydel irrigation projects, mining, oil drilling, pollution, resource extraction and road and transportation, put enormous pressure on natural resource base. There are some human-induced activities which relating to agriculture, fishery, expansion of forest, villages, grazing, increased domestic animals habitat depletion, exchange due to horticulture, monoculture forestry have led to different kinds of encroachment on natural resource, collection made by scientific educational institution, times exploitation by local authorities as revenue resource, times fuel wood collection, times food gathering, times food hunting, times smuggling of timber forest produce, times trophies specimen collection of medicinal plants and orchids and times unregulated trade market forces, human-induced disasters causing stress on natural resource, times floods, times major oil spills leakage, times wildlife depredation, times epidemic, times forest fires due to humming and times intentional forest fire, threats to NRM, wrong and faculty approaches, times diseases, times fire as management tool, times genetic uniformity, times hybridization, times inadequate water and food for wildlife, times increased competition, times introduction of exotic species, times lack of patronage of local native species, times low population restricted range, protectionism, management of human resources, times change in people's lifestyle, times conflicting increasing demands, times dilution of traditional values, times erosion of indigenous knowledge, times generation gap, times human harassment, times ignorance lack of awareness, times inadequate trained human resource, times inappropriate land use, times lack of effective management, times negative attitude, times tourism development, political and policy issue, times civil unrest political movement, times change in use tenure legal status, times insurgency or armed conflict, times intercommunity conflict, times intervention failure, times lack of clear policy implementation, times lack of interdepartmental coordination, times lack of intervention, military activities, times people's pressure. 4.5.1 Threats to biodiversity. The following categories of threats have been recognized by International Union Council for Conservation Nature, IUCN, endangered. Under this category included taksha whose number have reduced to a critical level of whose habitats have been so drastically reduced that they are seen to be in immediate danger of extinction, e.g., Encipens khasiana, Rhinanthera inscutiona, Vanda cerulean, vulnerable, taksha likely to move into endangered category in near future if the causal factors continue. Operating included taksha of which most or all the population are decreasing because of over-exploitation, extensive destruction of habitats, or other environmental disturbances. For e.g. Discora deltoidea, taxus, Walliciana rare, taksha with small world population that are not at present endangered or vulnerable but are at risk. These taksha are usually localized within restricted geographical areas or habitats or are thinly scattered over more extensive range. E.g. Phryxia macrantha, Rauwolfia scapentina threatened. The term threatened is used in the conservation context for species which are in one of the three categories: endangered, vulnerable and rare. India's biodiversity is one of the most significant in the world. As many as 45,000 species of wild plants and over 77,000 of wild animals have recorded, which comprise about 6.5% of the world's known wildlife. In the last few decades, India has lost at least half its forests, polluted over 70% of its water bodies, built on or cultivated much of its grasslands and degraded most of its coast. 4.5 to conservation of biodiversity. Why conservation? Indian region is a treasure house at wild genetic resources. Wild species and relatives of crop plants contain valuable genes that are of immense genetic values in crop improvement programs. The important wild-related species and types in various crop groups prevailing under different phytogeographic zones at the country needs particular attention in the agrobiodiversity management system for a sustainable use to help maintain food, nutritional and agricultural economic security. The main objectives of biodiversity conservation are times the main objectives of the conservations are times the conservation of biological diversity times the sustainable use of component biodiversity. India's efforts for biodiversity conservation. Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, 1983, suggested the following conservation measure times cultivated varieties in current use times obsolete cultivars times primitive cultivars or land races times wild species and weedy species closely related to cultivated varieties times wild species of potential values to man times special genetic stock developed by man times the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources. In situ conservation times it includes conservation of plant and animals in their native ecosystems or even in man-made ecosystem where they naturally occur times it applies only to wild fauna and flora. Times it aims at preservation of land races with wild relatives in which genetic exists. Ex situ conservation times it is done through establishment of gene banks, times it is the chief mode for preservation of genetic resources, times generally seeds or in vitro maintained plants cells, tissue and organs are preserved under appropriate conditions. The drawbacks of ex situ conservation are times loss of viability over passage of time and susceptibility to insect or pathogen attack, times inability to maintain distinct clones except for inbreed and apomixed species, times non-applicability to vegetative propagated crop. 4.6 Management of natural resources. There is an urgent need to understand about the various issues and dynamics in the management of natural resources. With the exponential increase in human population and increased technological advancement, the causes and excuse for the exploitation of natural resources has increased many folds. There is an immediate need for optimization of its usage. This is possible only when we adopt the concepts of management and conservation of natural resources universally all across the regions. Management and conservation mean scientific utilization of resources while maintaining their sustained yield and quality. India produces only half of the national requirement of petroleum products and it imports the rest from other countries. Natural gas is the most popular petroleum product and its consumption during last 2 decades has increased tenfold. If we need to save fossil fuels from total exhaustion, we should encourage the usage of non-conventional resources of energy such as solar energy, wind energy, biomass energy, etc., according to World Conservation Strategy on Natural Resource Management. NRM. It is the management of human use of the biosphere, lithosphere and hydrosphere so that it may yield the greatest sustainable benefit to the present generation, while maintaining its potential to meet the needs and aspiration, not the greed, of future generation. With the current rate of development, population growth and migration, communities are increasingly unable to meet their sustained needs. Growing demand for fuel, wood and other forest products, pollution due to industrialization and a market for rare animal species and medicinal plants have all threatened the biological diversity and thereby have hampered sustainable human development. Further, the race for development and cultivation of improved varieties in larger area has threatened the biodiversity to a considerable extent. The complex dynamics of resource management system can be well understood by the flowchart, Figure 1, and various issues dimensions involved in resource management is represented in Figure 2. Figure 1, Complex and Dynamic Resources Management Systems. Figure 2, Various issues dimensions involved in resource management. Look at the screen. 4.6.1 Meaning and need for resource management. The main driving forces of resource consumption are population and economic growth, and the pattern of development, broadly defined to include technological level, economic structure, and the patterns of production and consumption. The projected 50% growth in the global population over the next 50 years will put a significant pressure on the environment. If, over the next 50 years, the population of the developing countries achieves levels of material wealth similar to today's levels in industrialized countries, world consumption of resources would increase by a factor ranging from 2 to 5. Without dramatic technological improvements or changes in the patterns of consumption, growth in resource use and environmental impacts due to increased population and economic growth in developing countries are likely to outweigh technological efficiency gains in industrialized countries. Human wealth is based on the use and consumption of natural resources, including materials, energy and land. Continued increase in resource use and the related environmental impacts can have a multitude of negative effects, leading to ecological crises and security threats. The sustainable use and management of natural resources have therefore come into focus and has been the subject of many policy discussions over more than a decade, beginning with the summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. Over the past 50 years, humans have changed ecosystems more rapidly and extensively than in any comparable period in human history, largely to meet rapidly growing demands for food, fresh water, timber, fiber and fuel. This has resulted in substantial gains in human well-being and economic development, but these gains have been achieved at growing costs in the form of the degradation of many ecosystems. Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, 2005. What is driving our material and energy use to the extent that it is becoming a global environmental problem and a threat to future generations? There is no simple answer to this question, because a number of interdependent socio-economic and environmental factors are at play. Nevertheless, there are three basic factors which determine the growth of resource consumption and the resulting environmental impacts of human production and consumption patterns. 4.6.2 Dynamics of Resource Management. Public policy in India has for long appreciated that access to shared or common natural resources, NR, is crucial to local livelihood strategies. Many of the rural poor depend directly on shared NR, yet they often live in ecologically marginal areas and have limited and insecure rights to NR. A recurrent question in the rural development debate has been, how are poverty and access to NR linked and what are the policy implications of these linkages? A principal conclusion has been that decentralized NR management regimes will enhance both sustainability and equitable access to NR by the poor. Policy has focused principally on institutional frameworks conferring rights, responsibilities, and roles in decentralized NR management, DNRM. In India, two formal institutional systems have been identified as having the legitimacy and potential to enhance rural livelihoods: partnership models. In the last decade, there have been significant moves towards formal NR management partnerships between the public administration and local user groups. The two most institutionally evolved examples, for which guidelines have been promulgated, are Joint Forest Management, JFM, and Watershed Management, WM. A constitutional amendment passed in 1993 aimed to strengthen local government, collectively called Panchayati Raj institutions, at district, block and village levels. Some of the seats at these levels are reserved for marginal and vulnerable community members and for women. Village-level panchayats have become responsible for preparing plans for the management of NR within their boundaries. The support for decentralization is based less on any proven success than on ideological convictions related to the importance of local involvement and self-determination in the development process. There is, however, a growing realism about the strong, centralizing forces within the polity and bureaucracy that inhibit meaningful transfer of access and control over NR. Equally, earlier optimism regarding collective action has been tempered by failed participatory common resources. Are not considered worth collective action. The decentralization agenda has, however, led to changes in the institutional arrangements for managing shared NR. Through partnership models, and indirectly through Panchayati Raj, communities have been given some autonomy in deciding priorities for NR management, funds to develop NR, assets and guidelines to promote community mobilization. These decentralization initiatives represent major achievements in challenging the previous dominance of line department control over all aspects of NR management. The objective of sustainable, equitable and efficient DNRM is, however, far from being realized, as our examination of the source of political demand for decentralization and the content of the programs and projects themselves revealed. 4.6.3 Management of forests. The word forest is derived from the Latin word foris meaning outside, the reference being to a village boundary or fence, and it must have included all uncultivated and uninhabited land. Today a forest is any land managed for the diverse purpose of forestry, whether covered with trees, shrubs, climbers, etc., or not. The Indian word jungle has been adopted in the English language to describe a collection of trees, shrubs, climbers, etc., that are not grown in a regular manner as contrasted with forest, which is any vegetation under a systematic management. Technically, forest has been defined as in general point of view, a forest is an area set aside for the production of timber and other forest produce or maintained under woody vegetation for certain indirect benefits which it provides, e.g. climatic or protective. B. In ecological point of view, forest is a plant community predominantly of trees and other woody vegetation, usually with a closed canopy, and C. In logical point of view, an area of land proclaimed to be a forest under a forest law. Forestry is the theory and practice of all that constitutes the creation, conservation, and scientific management of forests and the utilization of their resources to provide for the continued production of the required goods and services. Forests are a very striking feature of the land surface. They vary greatly in composition and density and stand in marked contrast with meadows and pastures. The scenic effect of forests changes with the seasons, like the patterns in a kaleidoscope. Certain forests are evergreen, like the deodar forests of Kashmir, while others are deciduous, becoming leafless either before the advent of winter when vegetative activity almost ceases, such as the oak forests of the Himalayas, or else just before the onset of intense dry summer to reduce transpiration to the minimum, like the teak forests of central India. The falling leaves in some species become bright orange or golden yellow. In others, the young foliage is pink. Such autumnal and verbal tinges are in vivid contrast with the general green or straw-colored background and are extremely pleasing. Unlike animals, plants do not have the power of locomotion. They also cannot construct shelters or generate heat to withstand the adverse effects of the environment of which they are captives. Therefore, to survive they bear the evidence of this fact in the form of structural adaptations, such as leaflessness in summer to minimize transpiration, thorns to ward off browsers, poisonous sap, etc. The forests of a country are a natural asset of immense value. Unlike its minerals resources, including fossil fuels, which in course of time either get exhausted or their utilization will become uneconomic due to increased costs for obtaining and processing them, the forests, if of adequate extent, ideally dispersed, scientifically managed and judiciously utilized, can be kept perpetually productive and useful, conferring many benefits, direct and indirect, on the people. Thus, forests are a renewable resource. Directly, forests meet the needs of small timber, fuel, bamboos and a variety of other products, including fodder, which is indispensable requirements of the people living in close proximity of the forests. They also provide facility for the grazing of their livestock and yield a variety of products of commercial and industrial value such as structural timber, charcoal, and raw materials for making paper, newsprint, rayon, panel products, bidi leaves, gums, resin, dyes, tans and a number of other economic products including medicinal drugs. Forests also provide employment to a large population engaged in their protection, tending, harvesting and regeneration, as also in ancillary occupations processing forest raw material and marketing them. These are productive functions of the forests, management of state forests. No forest should be permitted to be worked without the government having approved the management plan, which should be in a prescribed format and in keeping with the national forest policy. In order to meet the growing needs for essential goods and services which the forests provides, it is necessary to enhance the forest cover and productivity of the forests through the application of scientific and technical inputs. Production forestry programs, while aiming at enhancing the forest cover in the country and meeting national needs, should also be oriented to narrowing, by the turn of the century, the increasing gap between demand and supply of fuel wood. No such program, however, should entail clear felling of adequately stocked natural forests. Rights and concessions. The rights and concession, including grazing, should always remain related to the carrying capacity of forests. The capacity itself should be optimized by increased investment, silvicultural research and development of the area. Stall feeding of cattle should be encouraged.
The requirements of the community which cannot met by the rights and concessions so determined should be met by development of social forestry outside the reserved forests. The holders of customary rights and concessions forest areas should be motivated to identify themselves with the protection and development of forests from which they derive benefits. The rights and concessions from forests should primarily be for the bona fide use of the communities living within and around forest areas, especially the tribal division of forest lands for non-forest purposes. Forest land or land with tree cover should not be treated merely as a resource readily available to be utilized for various projects and programs, and as a national asset which requires to be properly safeguarded for providing sustained benefits to the entire community. Wildlife conservation. Forest management should take special care of the needs of wildlife conservation, and forest management plans should include prescriptions for this purpose. It is specially essential to provide for corridors linking the protected areas in order to maintain genetic continuity between artificially repeated subsections of migrant wildlife, tribal people and forests, having regard to the symbiotic relationship between the tribal people and forests, a primary task of all agencies responsible for forest management, including the forces development. Corporations should be to associate the tribal people closely in the protection, regeneration and development of forests, as well as to provide gainful employment to the people living in and around the forest. Shifting cultivation. Shifting cultivation is affecting the environment and productivity of the land adversely. Alternative avenues of income suitable, harmonized with the right land use practices should be devised to discourage shifting cultivation. Forest-based industries. As far as possible, a forest-based industry should raise the raw material needed for meeting its requirement. Forest-based industries must not only provide employment to the local people on priority but also involve them fully in raising trees and raw material. Forest extension, forest conservation programs cannot succeed without the willing support and cooperation of the people. A direct interest in forests, their development and conservation, and to make them conscious of the value of trees, wildlife and nature in general. Forestry education. Forestry should be recognized both as a scientific discipline as well as a profession. Agriculture universities and institutions dedicated to the development of forestry education should formulate curricula and course for imparting academic and professional excellence, keeping view the manpower needs of the country. Forestry research, with the increasing recognition of the importance of forests for environment, health, energy and employment, emphasis must be laid on scientific forestry research, necessitating adequate strengthening the research base as well as new priorities for action. 4.6.4 Management of soil resources. rapid deterioration of soil health and degradation of soil environment as a consequence of persistent nutrient depletion and operating process of erosion, salinization, acidification and desertification have been at concern to a soil scientists in recent years as these are posing a threat to the potentiality of our soil resources to support the increasing food demands in future. Soil degradation times physical soil erosion, water logging, desertification, compaction, crusting, overgrazing, times chemical nutrient runoff, acidification, salinization, alkalinization, loss of organic matter, nutrient imbalance, nutrient depletion, accumulation of toxicants, times biological monoculture, pesticides and herbicides, disposal of industrial waste, toxic containing sewage water, genetic manipulation, approaches towards soil conservation. Times the primary purpose of soil conservation is to prevent soil erosion and heal the damage where it has not advanced too far to respond to curative methods. Times the land should wear a vegetative cover throughout the year. Times engineering and agronomic practices should be applied conjointly. Reclamation of eroded lands. Times ravines should be provided with sufficient and suitable vegetative cover. Times instead of agriculture, these lands should be reclaimed for forestry, pasture or horticulture. Times their deficiency in nutrients and moisture for plants' growth should be improved. Times further misuse of such land should be prevented. Over-transplanting by man and cattle trails fenced etc. Times vegetative cover provided should be protected against reckless destruction by local population. Measures for controlling soil erosion deposition hazard. Times plantation at wind breaks and shelter belts. Times sand dune stabilization. Times stubble mulching. Times vine string cropping. Times primary and secondary tillage. Times conserving soil moisture. 4.6.5 Management of water resources. Groundwater has been exploited in India quite substantially in the past few decades for irrigation. However, unlike surface water resources, there has been a conspicuous lack of scientific assessment of groundwater resources. Availability of this important natural resource has been taken for granted. Utilization of groundwater has not been commensurate with the available potential in a state, e.g., about 86% in Gujarat and 3% in Assam, indicating considerable regional imbalance. India has 4% of the world's water resources. The present water demand of India's agriculture is nearly 83% of the total water use in the country and shall not change appreciable by the end of the country. Ministry of Environment, 1992, had made projections for water demand of various utility sectors for 2000 and 2025 AD. Use of most of this allocated water for agriculture is confined to 33% irrigated area and the remaining 67% is still dependent on monsoon rains. The disproportionate use of water in certain pockets results in wastage as discernible from water in certain pockets result in wastage as discernible from water logging of vast cultivable areas caused by the seepage and evaporation between dam gate and the field, and only 15% of the wasteful flood irrigation method. Excessive use of water makes the field more vulnerable to soil erosion. Irrigation, thus, can be identified as the most important single activity responsible for agriculture-induced environmental stress, although other activities such as deforestation for expanding agriculture, production-oriented agronomic practices, use of fertilizers and plants protection chemicals have their individual contribution. Approaches towards water conservation, management at surface water resources such as times canal water, times runoff water, times cadines, times nadis, tanks, times gully, times plugging, times water harvesting dams, times water spreading, times percolation tank, management of groundwater resources. The groundwater resources in arid region have four major problems. Times 65% area has saline groundwater with total soluble salt content over 3200 ppm, times deep static water level, times poor yield from wells, times due to overexploitation, static water level started declining, soluble salt content have increased and yield reduced. Following methods are available for artificially recharging the aquifers, water spreading, times recharging through pits, wells and shafts, times pumping to induce recharge from surface water bodies, extension approaches. For NRM, times creation of natural resources like forests, water bodies, etc., times conservation of resources in an ecology niche, times regeneration of natural resources by organizing self-propelling processes, times preservation through social fencing, times recycling of waste-water byproducts, times rejuvenation of degraded or age-old resource base, times protection of target species, times pollution control through policy formulation, times elimination of negative factors operating in the ecosystems, times social fencing for protection, preservation, times integration of biotic, abiotic and social factors, times rationalization in the use of dwindling resources, times ITK and ITW, appropriate use and application, times watershed management to generate livelihood and conserve natural resources, times monitoring, benefit monitoring evaluation, BME, times auditing is required to get account of depletion and to suggest interventions, times people's participation. This is the most important and critical to accomplish any objective in NRM. 4.7 Summary. Today, the entire world has awakened to the need for maintaining judicious use of the natural resources and adopting developmental models and policies which assure proper environmental protection. It is well known that the humans all across the globe are not only polluting nature but also destroying it. Thorough and aggressive expansion of urbanization vis-a-vis consumerism, the role of local community and different institutions in the management of natural resources at local level is as complex as the complexities of the ecosystems. There is a huge misunderstanding between researchers from natural and social sciences who have attempted to understand the natural resource management separately from their own discipline perspectives, leading to oversimplification of the issues of continued degradation of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next video with next chapter.